Tracey, thank you so much for having us today. It's a real pleasure, number one, to meet you, but to be able to do a little bit of an interview right here on the stage of Glory, which is here in the Gananoque Thousand Islands Playhouse. So the set is phenomenal, and normally the closest I'd get to a set is front row, but to be right up here is pretty awesome. So thank you for hosting us this morning.
Thank you.
It's very timely to have the history and the story of the Preston Rivulettes, especially in this area where hockey and women's hockey is coming up to a pretty good milestone. And that's with Kingston Red Barons celebrating their 50th anniversary since their inception. So the interest in the production that you have brought to Gananoque is extremely interesting to us. So can you share with us what was the main incentive for you to bring this story to life and your interest in women's hockey?
Of course. It started mostly from not knowing this story and kind of being a little bit upset that I didn't, and feeling like as an artist we always want to try to give voices where there aren't. And so I felt that by bringing this story that's inspired by the Preston Rivulettes to life on stage, we'd be able to kind of share a piece of history and a piece of not only hockey history, but our country's history to the stage. And it started because I came across an old photo of a women's hockey team, probably from early 1900s. And it was an organized team photo. And I obviously knew women were skating at that time, but I didn't know they were playing organized sports in that way. And so that started the research tunnel. And I soon found out that there was leagues right across the country, in the West and the East and in the prairies, and eventually that these leagues kind of met and played in what was known as the Dominion Championships at that time, which was huge to think that in the 30s there was teams from the West playing the East, and that travel involved. And the first game that the Preston Rivulettes played with out of Ontario was in Edmonton, and they'd never really left their home province before. And the days on the train and what's involved in that, we kind of don't think about that now, about how long it would take someone in the 30s to get somewhere to play a game. So that was kind of the inspiration, was this photo and researching the teams. And I think I was so inspired by the story of the Preston Rivulettes because of the champions they became, and also because the team was started by two sets of sisters. And the idea of being able to kind of have these women portrayed on stage was really exciting to me, like the shorthand between sisters and how we relate so much. I guess we're more blunt and more free-speaking when with our relatives or friends that we treat like relatives. So that really excited me as a playwright, as well as Hilda Ranscombe, who was the greatest player of her time, was on that team, and I think she deserves to be recognized as that, and was an incredible player and by all accounts an incredible captain and team player, and never put herself above anybody else on the team, even though she very much was the best player on the team by everyone outside. Yeah. But she would never take that credit. She said, everybody is the most valuable player, which makes me want to cry.
Yeah. It's really interesting that we've got women who really don't take no for an answer when they're driven and they really want to get involved in sport. Yeah. And it's been an uphill battle. Did you ever play hockey?
I played field hockey. I grew
Close enough.
Yeah, close enough. I grew up in a small town on Vancouver Island, and I was never asked if I wanted to play ice hockey. I didn't know any girls who played ice hockey, but I played a lot of soccer. I played a lot of softball and tennis and other outdoor sports, and I skied. But it was one of those. Now, when I look back, I was like, oh, really would have liked to be asked. I really would have liked to have had that opportunity.
It's kind of interesting. You've talked about in your intro on the Glory about 4 women who made it happen. Can you talk a little bit about some of the barriers that they had to tackle in order to get the opportunity to actually step on the ice?
Of course. I'm sure you experienced some of them yourself. I think first of all, the biggest one was because there was no team in Preston, they had to build the team from scratch. Ice time was obviously a big thing because the men had all the ice time, so they had to practice at very strange times. So that was a big one. Money was huge because they started their team during the Depression. So just having the money for first aid kits and refs and ice and all those and travel was huge. That was a massive expense, and just actual uniforms. That was a big. You forget how expensive things are until you have to go, oh, wait, start putting the numbers together. They experienced a lot of sexism, which of course wasn't sexism at the time. It was just how people spoke. A lot of judgment from men and women. There's this great article, well, not great and not so great, in Chatelaine magazine that talked about how women shouldn't be playing hockey, and they're too fragile and their flesh isn't able to kind of handle that kind of physical activity. So there was men who didn't think it was right, and there was women who didn't think they should be playing either.
Exactly.
So it wasn't just a male opinion, it was women going, what? And also, how an athletic body was perceived at that time versus the feminine norm, or what quote unquote norm. So they were kind of getting looked at strangely from both sexes, right? But it also, because they were a team, I think it probably fueled them even more.
Thank heavens.
Yeah.
It's interesting because 30 years later, when our organization, the Kingston Red Barons, started, they went through a lot of the same things. Really? The challenges to get ice, to get recognized, just to get the opportunities for referees to take them seriously. You had the enablers for sure that would get on board and help you as much as possible. And we're fortunate to have a good network in Kingston that felt that it was worthy enough and really allowed the whole opportunity to start. But thank heavens the sisters were so persistent and driven to keep going to make it happen.
Exactly.
Because that's when the door starts to open.
Totally. And in the end, it's your skill that proves, right? And they became champions, and their team was 100% behind them. Yeah. And so proud and so supportive. To the point that they were more popular. The women's team was more popular than the men's team. It was them that was traveling across the country. It was them that were, held the records. But still, even though they were the most supportive team, when it came to things like ice time, the men's team still, they still trumped them, which is just like, what? How does that work when you're bringing more people to the arena and you're you're the more popular team?
It takes time to break down those barriers and persistence. So thank heavens that was the case. In our world, we had 2 women who were determined to play hockey, had traveled all over the place to play hockey. And so they kind of decided, why are we doing this? What's wrong with Kingston? Let's get going. So they started the hockey program. And it evolved over the years, and the caliber and the attraction, and it just kept growing until it got to a really nice senior A level.
Wow.
And then when the hockey program ended, girls hockey had more or less taken over minor hockey, and so it had served its purpose, the same as I don't think women's hockey would have been as far along the way without the Rivulettes. Like,
No.
it's unbelievable the role that these teams play in history.
Exactly.
So we're so excited that you've brought it to light and making it so visible across Canada.
Yeah, it's an incredible journey. When you write a play and premiere a play, you always hope that it will have a life after the first production, but it doesn't always.
Yeah.
And so I think part of what makes this show successful is the story, and people wanting to hear the story and going, finally, like, somebody is telling this story, because it deserves to be told, and they deserve to be recognized. And
the story itself resonates with so many other women who experienced the same thing in order to get the opportunity to play.
Yep.
So I think your audiences will probably really connect with a lot of women who are appreciative for you bringing the story to light, but just making sure that it is well known, because it is such a success story.
It is.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it really is. And it's also, you imagine what would have happened with women's hockey if World War II hadn't started. Like, they were on such a trajectory at the time, and they were talking about the Olympics, they were talking about world championships. So they were having a lot of the same conversations probably that happened in the 90s. And so what would have happened if World War II never, wasn't there, didn't exist?
Well, can you share with us a little bit how you got all of the data, the history, because we find that to try to go back and show in the record books, which everybody needs to see, that's a real barrier itself.
It is. I think one of the biggest resources for me were newspapers from the time, because and there was an article or a column written by Alexandrine Gibb in the Toronto Star, and it was called The No Man's Land of Sport. So it was great to have her view on women's sports, because the flip side was where the column was written by men. So you could hear the different voices and the different kind of attitudes towards the sport, to women playing sport. So that was so helpful as far as not only like the stats of the games and who was scoring and who played what position, but also I wanted to incorporate an announcer into the sound design for the show, because all the hockey games are done to kind of a 30s swing, electro swing sound. And with an announcer present, so that the announcer is calling the game, so that we can hear the male voice within this women's world, because it's so important to know what they heard and what they had to fight against, and the jokes and the and the put downs sometimes that weren't necessarily malicious, but it's not exactly something you'd like to hear said about you. So the newspapers were incredibly helpful. There was a woman named Carly Adams who's written a book called Queens of the Ice, and it is about the Preston Rivulettes, and that was insanely helpful as well, as far as the research that she's done, and there's a couple other books, and you're kind of just trying to piece together all the research you possibly can find. And the Cambridge Sports Hall of Fame was really helpful as well in sending me the information that they had, and family. Have, now that the play is out there in the world, we're starting to meet more family members. 4 of the women. Out of 4 of the women, only 1 had children. So I've been able to kind of be in touch with them and learn more from them, and I've been in touch with now the nephew and the niece of Hilda Ranscombe and Nellie Ranscombe, and so there's more information that's come to light through them. So it really is kind of, every week it feels like I learn something new still, because there's somebody else that comes out of the woodwork and it's like, oh my gosh, I knew this person here, and this is what, so there's all these neat connections.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Can you share with us just briefly some of the drastic differences in the game that
sure.
you came across?
Well, it was a very, very physical game. The women's game was very physical. There was tons of fights. There's a great story about this woman who played for Winnipeg, whose nose got ripped off and it was hanging on by a thread, but there was missing teeth, there was stitches, there was lots of penalties. It was a very physical game. So I think that is a huge difference now. Yeah. But it's neat, like you can find old the CBC interviews, where they talk about, like, if somebody wanted to go, I was going to go. These are women in their 80s talking about, how they used to fight and take each other out. So that was a huge difference in the game. Of course, the goalies didn't have masks. There was very little padding on the players at all. So that was another big difference, which of course you'll see in the play. It was a bit of a different game as far as because the sticks were straight. They didn't have the kind of curves like they do now, and the ice surfaces were not anywhere near as polished as they are now. Like often they were playing on natural ice, so it was weather contingent. Like if it was a warm day and it was slushy, you were playing in slushy ice. Yeah. And so that was definitely a challenge, which I don't think anyone has to worry about that much. Maybe on that they have that outdoor game. Maybe
the historic game here in Kingston, they use square pucks.
Oh really?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
So that was even prior Rivulettes. Yeah. So those are some of the different. It changed right as the Rivulettes started. Was was the forward passing, right at kind of 29-30. If you were, I think, in the neutral or the offensive zone, you had to pass back to a player, like rugby. So they changed that to the forward passing. But I was just trying to kind of imagine how that would work. Like it would be such a different game to have to pass back to somebody.
Well, when I looked online about the Rivulettes, it said that they started with 7 players.
On the ice?
I don't know.
Oh, I think it was on their team. Like that's all they had. So often they'd play a whole. Wow. They'd have to play a whole game because they just didn't have subs. The other thing that I was reading about was, I guess, like if your goalie was in the penalty box, you could put another player in the net and they could play with that stick, but you didn't have another goalie. Yeah. So you had to hope that your goalie was always keeping it together and not trying to.
Did you come across anything about how long the game was? Did they play 3 periods? Was it just? Yeah,
at that time they did. So it was I think they had 10-minute intermissions. Yeah. But they were the 20-minute periods. I did read somewhere that sometimes this was sometimes what happened is if the men had the ice booked, they'd have to shorten theirs to like 15-minute periods to make sure that they got their game in. But they would play often, because if they went to Montreal, they would play 2 games. And then the total would, they'd take the total of the 2 games as the
It's kind of interesting when the Red Barons started. Of course, ice is very expensive. And so we had to make sure a game would fit within the hour. Oh. So we would try to play 3, maybe straight time, 15-minute periods, and or if you could kind of squeeze in stop time, that'd be pushing it, but your 3rd period might be whatever time you had left. And of course you only had 50 minutes because they had to clean the ice, and that came out of your rental. So it was kind of interesting to see how the game has morphed over time. Yeah. So I was curious around some of those differences.
Yeah, so those were the kind of bigger ones that kind of jumped out at me. And of course, like the lines on the ice, it would have been very kind of a bit different, but they still had the 3 zones and at that time. And Yeah, I think those are the more specific things. I mean, the skates look different. The different look of all the equipment was very different.
Did you find taking the athletes off the ice and putting them on the stage difficult to choreograph? Like, how did you stick handle through some of that?
In my head, I always knew what I wanted it to look like. So it became a combination of hockey technique. So, me learning hockey technique to then bring my jazz background and swing background to that. So it became, how do you do like a crossover step but dance it, like a skate crossover but dance it? How do you stick handle but then put a dance movement to it? So it became, there's a practice scene in the show that kind of sets up that world for the audience. Like this is what it looks like in our world. And then when we get into the games, I can bring in the emotion, I can bring in the tension, I can bring in, the energy of a game and those dynamics. I've always found that when I see skating represented on stage with rollerblades, that it prevents you from really exploring the energy of a game, because we're not professional rollerbladers, and rollerblades aren't the same as skates, and so as dancers, we're able to kind of bring that dynamic to the stage through our movement combined with your movement. And so the reaction from the audience has been so fantastic, because when I could see it in my head, then I could kind of see it in the performers, but then you always want to find out, how is the audience going to see this? So it's been so exciting to kind of have their feedback and get them on board with it. And
So based on the audience reaction and your satisfaction with how everything's going, is there anything else in your mind about women in sport and or a message that could be told in the future?
Well, I think with this piece, I mean, yes, it's a story about hockey, but it's a sports story, so it crosses sports, right? And so I think for young soccer players, it's the same. You can find the same parallels, right? And that same passion and desire to play, and the same battles that you might have to fight as a young woman playing. I think they're still there. So I think what this play does is energize women and young women into being okay with fighting that fight and knowing that they're not alone, and also saying this is part of the game. The fight is part of the game. The off ice battle is part of your game, and that's okay that it's different than the men's, because
Absolutely.
it makes winning that much more incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, certainly from a person who has spent a lot of time in sport and really appreciated the opportunities that we were able to secure over time. We thank you for bringing this amazing story to light. We're very excited to see it, and I think just the motivation that this should provide to so many women athletes will be one of the real benefits. As you say, there's lots of battles still to be had, but when you sit back after having played a role in a transition into sport and to see where it's at, you're hoping that the fuel is there to have others step up and take it even further. So thank you so much for bringing this to the glory to this neck of the woods. It's going to be phenomenal to see it. So we really appreciate all the work that you've done.
Oh, thank you.